Good morning. How many of you all came here to have like a 500 PowerPoint slide, death by PowerPoint? We're not doing that. We're here to provide you some very useful and salient information. First, I want to thank Infomex for allowing us to speak today. We really appreciate the opportunity, and I really appreciate those guys sitting on the back row that you very rarely get acknowledged. This is a really top group of people taking care of the sound and the video and everything else. So thank you guys for what you do back there. We really appreciate that. How many are first-time Infomex attendees in this group? Any first-timers? You guys raise your hand. We got 4 first-time Infomex attendees. How many of folks are suppliers to the pharmaceutical and biotech market? Any raise your hand? How about any small biotech companies? Any biotech companies? Any big pharma companies? Any media? I know we have at least one media here. So we appreciate you all being here. I'm going to walk through a couple points, and then we're going to turn it over to a great panel that I look forward to introducing to you in just a moment. March 2008, at least 81. This is an interactive panel. Does anybody know what that means? What that date and that number means? Anybody? Ring a bell with anybody. March 2008, at least 81 people died in the United States due to contaminated heparin. That was what was the initiative to start an organization called RX360 that all of us are involved with. And we are working together to protect patient safety. Every one of us that are in the pharmaceutical industry, we're not making widgets. We're making stuff that's going to go into his wife, my child, your brother, your dad. So it's a very serious business. We all take it very seriously. 9 out of the top 10. 9 out of the top 10 pharmaceutical companies in the world are members of RX360. 17 of the top 20 pharma companies in the world. We all take this very seriously. Suppliers in this hall, Ampac Fine Chemicals, DSM, BASF, companies you recognize have joined with us to protect patient safety. And hopefully by the end of this talk, we'll give you some good reasons to think about joining RX360 and some actionable things that will help you run your business better. Greater than 80%. Greater than 80% of the medicines taken in this country are manufactured in India and China. You all that have plants outside the United States are critical to the safety and security of the United States, Europe, and the world, because that's where we get our medicines. In the United States, an emergency room crash cart, that's the crash cart that comes in when your dad has had a heart attack and they're going to put life-saving medicine into his body to save him. 100% of that medicine is made outside the United States. You all are critical to the safety and security of the American supply chain. Up on our panel here, we have a great group of distinguished guests. You know, it's first time to Infomex. We have Ben Mills. He spent his time 20 years at Amgen, overseeing the Amgen quality audits and supply chain. He now works for our partner, British Standards Institute, overseeing the RX360 audit program. We have Bill Cope, our friend from J&J. Bill's a senior director at J&J. He's been where you are if you're in a little company. He's now in a giant company. We have Robin Kumaluyi from Novartis, a VP, vast experience. And you cannot imagine by looking at this young group of people, but we have like 130 years of experience in the quality of the supply chain. These folks have stuff you need to hear. Ben has just come back from Mexico where he was working on an audit. He oversees all our audits. He sees everything. These two distinguished friends of mine have seen just about everything, so a lot you can hear. And then my friend Mark Paxton, just from the FDA. He's joined RX360 as our CEO, the first official employee of RX360. So a great group. So right here we have Novartis, the #1 pharmaceutical company in the world, $47 billion. We have J&J, $32.3 billion. And we have Amgen at $20 billion. How many of you would like to sell your product to Amgen, J&J, Novartis, or are currently selling your products to Amgen, J&J, Novartis? I know when I was a supplier, I always wanted to work with these folks. Most of the supply base is relatively small. This number, 2 billion, that is about the largest supplier we have in the room here, Patheon, maybe 2 billion. Evonik, part of a bigger company, but maybe 2 billion. So we have a group of smaller companies, and we understand what you face as a smaller company. But what I want you to know and take away from this, we understand suppliers are critical. And we're going to have some direct observations from Ben. I'm going to turn the talk over to Ben Mills. He's going to tell you what he's seeing out in the field, what you need to be thinking about, and we're going to finish up with Mark, who's going to talk about it from his perspective as an FDA guy, and now why did he come into our consortium. And we're going to hear directly from Bill and Robin what they've seen in their 30-plus years each industry experience at big pharma and smaller companies, and what you need to know as a supplier. So I hope you walk out of this with a list of 5 or 6 bullet points that you can take back to your companies and say, here it is. This is what this is what we need to do. So Ben, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Scott. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for attending this session. I think that probably you share the same passion that we all share. Again, as Scott mentioned, RX360's goal really is to protect patient safety, ensure patient safety. And so, something that we reiterate time and time again to suppliers is that you're a very vital part of that whole supply chain. So what I'd like to do with you is just share a little bit of information about the things that I've seen out in the field as I go audit suppliers. So as Scott mentioned, BSI is the partner with RX360 that provides the audits of suppliers on behalf of the membership of RX360. So if you haven't become familiar with the RX360 model, we have a co-sponsored audit model where multiple sponsors who are members of RX360 can go in together on a particular audit of a supplier, share the cost, and thereby reduce also the footprint of the amount of time it takes the suppliers to spend hosting audits at their facilities. One of the things that we're seeing is an increased regulatory scrutiny of the supply chain. So if you're in the supplier world, you probably have seen more and more requests for audits come across your desk. And what you need to do as a vital part of that supply chain is provide those audits and ensure that the information that's needed by the manufacturers is obtained by them, because they're going to be asked about it when regulators come to their company, right? So if you've ever been in a regulatory inspection, the regulators will ask you about this information, and you've got to know what's going on. 15 years ago, maybe it was okay to say, yes, we audit our suppliers, right? Okay, great. So show us how you determine what suppliers to audit, how often you audit them, and that type of thing, and you can provide that kind of justification. But now there's more of an emphasis around, okay, so now what do you know about your suppliers, right? And so we're digging deeper and deeper into the supply chain. So that's why RX360's audit program, I think, is so beneficial. We have a booth right over here. We'd love to talk to you, today or tomorrow if you have more questions about it. But what are the things that we're seeing? So we at BSI have auditors who are full-time employees, and they're stationed all around the world. And one of the advantages we have there is that we have auditors who can go into a facility in China or India or Australia, and they know the culture, they know the language, they know the kind of things to look for. And that's a real advantage, we think, because what we're looking for is that control. When we go to suppliers, one of the things that we'll ask them about is, okay, how do you manage your suppliers? And I have to tell you, it's kind of amazing, but not a lot of suppliers have really robust supplier management programs. They might have some information about their suppliers, but that information might be nothing more than a questionnaire that their supplier filled out and sent back to them. Resources are tight, and we understand that, but the regulatory agencies are definitely looking for deeper and deeper insight on behalf of the suppliers to their supplier base. So as Scott mentioned, I was at an API facility near Mexico City a couple weeks ago, and they told me that they were just starting to consider auditing their suppliers. And I confirmed with them that's probably a really good idea, because if there's an issue, regulatory agencies are going to follow the thread, right? They'll go to the manufacturer, then they'll work upstream to the supplier, and the supplier's supplier. This particular API facility, 100% of their materials comes from India and China, and so that is an expensive region, right? That's not really an easy place to go find, perform an audit, because it's so far away. But that's something that RX360 can help you with. So what are we seeing? We're seeing the typical things that you might expect in suppliers. Some suppliers are great, some suppliers need a little bit of work, but I think that one of the basic underlying elements is that they all know that they have a responsibility within the supply chain. But some of the things we're seeing are things around, failure to follow procedures. We're seeing some validation issues as well, validating processes, validating equipment, and then the everyday kind of upkeep of the equipment in terms of preventive maintenance programs, calibration programs, and that type of thing. One of the hot topics, though, that we've been hearing about a lot lately is data integrity, and so we're keeping an eye open for data integrity issues. And there are key attributes to data integrity that need to be understood by the supplier, because again, that's their responsibilities to understand how to manage the data. So there's kind of an acronym, ALCOA, and it stands for accurate, legible, contemporaneous, original, and attributable. So these are 5 elements of data that need to be considered. And when we think of data integrity, it seems like a huge Pandora's box of all sorts of different kind of issues, but basically it's what do you do with the data that you generate? Is that data that you generate maintained in a way that is robust? Can you reproduce that data? Can you show original data? Are you copying data? Are there multiple data entry points? Are there issues and errors in maybe how data is transcribed and that type of thing? Stuff that, if you're in the pharmaceutical world, you've had to deal with for a while, but this is something that's working its way upstream. So we really try to focus on data integrity issues and try to get folks to understand that the way they manage their data might very well be in the crosshairs of a regulatory agency should there be an issue. And we know that we're not trying to say as manufacturers of pharmaceutical medicines that it's the supplier's fault. The manufacturers have the ultimate responsibility, but everybody shares that responsibility. So that's what we're trying to do. So when you talk about data integrity, I was visiting another site in the northeast of the United States and looking at their dock and their warehouse procedures and that type of thing, and looking at how they actually disposition raw materials. And one of the things that we found was that they do it at a terminal that's on the receiving dock. But what we found was that the terminal didn't time out in a reasonable amount of time, right? So I saw somebody on the terminal, and 40 minutes later, I saw somebody else go back to the same terminal, and they didn't have to log in or do anything like that. So things like that are data integrity issues. They now what you'll see is tablets being used, right? And so employees take tablets throughout the entire manufacturing process and in the warehouses, and they're entering data in the tablets. They're performing GMP manipulations with the tablets and that kind of stuff. And what we're seeing is that there's a lack of control around those remote devices as well. So things that you need to keep in mind. All of that kind of information all gets to the data integrity. We've seen people share passwords, right? I was watching an employee pick material for a bomb at a supplier, and he didn't log in, and there was somebody else's name at the top of the screen, and I said, "You didn't log in, and that's not you." And he said, "I know, but we share passwords." Innocent enough. His management was kind of appalled, but that all gets down to the fact that there has to be control of data, because that's all information that needs to be controlled. So if I have anything to impart, it's the knowledge that suppliers are vital to delivering safe and effective medicines to patients. And as Scott said, that's all of us in this room, all the people we care about and love, are going to be taking these medicines. So there has to be that emphasis on control. There has to be that emphasis on being willing to partner with your customers to share that information. We were speaking to somebody today who works for a particular supplier of excipients, and he had a great attitude. He was saying that, they have nothing to hide. You want to audit? Come on in. We're proud of what we do, and we're welcoming anybody who wants to come in because it just benefits us. That's a fantastic attitude, because that's what we're really looking for. It's no longer an adversarial relationship as it was when I started auditing 20 years ago on behalf of Amgen. Now it's more of a partnership. And so we hope to impart upon all of you that the pharmaceutical industry looks upon all of you as critical partners, and appreciate your time. I'll pass it over to Bill.
Thanks, Ben. Can you hear me out there? Can you hear me in the back? Any questions? We're going to process check. We're going to go till about 12:15. We don't have anybody following us. And as Ben mentioned, our booth's right there. But if you have a question, raise your hand. This is a really great opportunity to talk to people who are well in the know on these subjects. Go.
That's great. Thanks, guys. There was just a point I'd like to come back on. I work for J&J, big company, multinational, everything from consumer products to medical devices to prescription drugs. Can everybody hear me okay? But I want to share that a little bit, but understanding too, over my career, I actually have worked in a range. I've been in startups. It's been biotech, small startup companies, and if I look over those years and the different experiences, there's a lot of similarities, and I'm sure a lot of similarities with what you're dealing with in here as well. Obviously, we're all impacted by global markets, right? We're making products now or distributing products at a much larger global global market environment. So we're experiencing regulators from all different types of spaces. Back in the beginning of my career, honestly, we were worried about the U.S. FDA, and then it became, MHRA and different, and now it's everywhere. And actually, what we also see are smaller regulatory authorities, which we wouldn't have really had on our radar, not too long ago, are coming in. They're doing inspections. They're asking us questions. They have their own perspective, and it's all about the patient safety piece. But what that drives to us as a company is, we're trying to stay ahead of that, trying to make sure that we're doing the right thing for everybody. I would say that. Changing regulations or expanding perspective is clearly there, and I know that you're dealing with this as well. But there's also the piece of being able, and I want to touch on the data integrity, is our ability to really conduct an effective investigation. It's something I always like to bring in as a compliance guy. The data integrity is not new. We've all been around long enough that you have to keep good records. But it's also the ability to be able to follow through that pedigree, which can come back to our suppliers or even suppliers to a supplier to be able to reproduce and conduct an effective investigation. If I think of opportunities where maybe there was a cross-contamination issue or something like that has come up, we need the ability to go all the way back. That's an important part of this. Hopefully you never have to experience that, but when it comes to time and there's either the documentation doesn't exist or it's the reliability behind that, all of us are in a difficult situation. So it's somewhat common sense, but if most of it, I think it is, if you stop and think it through, but it's real, and if you're not in the right place, it's painful for all of us. The other one is around, Ben mentioned some of the automated things. What we're experiencing as well too is, as we go to more automation, right, it benefits us in a lot of ways that, there's less transcription, there's that type of thing. It also can open up opportunities. So now you have some visibility of the things you may not have known before, right? There's timestamps. So if you're referring to a procedure, you're timestamping that in. Does the time align up? Did someone really go back and do that step? So, I would say that my advice on anything around a data integrity is really walk the process and look for error prevention. So much of it is the folks that maybe are on the shop floor are doing the best they can with what they have, and I think as a leadership and all, we also need to get back in and really walk the job with them, understand what we can be doing to prevent errors and give them the best tools. The other thing I would say is, and this kind of takes me back to some of the investigation piece, is unfortunately you need to know, we talk about upstream, your suppliers, and knowing, the reliability of your incoming materials. I think there's variability in how far some folks get involved in that. As a dosage form manufacturer, obviously we're looking at our suppliers, but our suppliers need to have the right programs in place there as well, because obviously it's a rippling effect. But unfortunately, you also need to know your downstream. Where are your products headed? And I know that there are wholesalers and different things getting involved in this, or even being used in a manner that you may not know. It is important to know, though, as best as you can, because the same type of thing, it will come, you follow the thread backwards, and then you, of course, find yourself involved in a situation where someone is in your house and you didn't know that it was ultimately going in some areas, so you have to be prepared for that. The last piece I would just mention from an auditing standpoint, which I think is one of the real benefits of the RX360 concept, is we're all dealing with changing landscapes, right? Business changes, it expands, it contracts. You move into new markets, something changes, and we're all trying to stay ahead of that, and we need that flexibility. And what it looks like this year could be different next year. So being able to, from a business planning even, to know that you can manage better that volatility from an end user, drug manufacturer, it puts us obviously in a stronger position and able to manage better. But then obviously on the side of receiving the audits, you're now not having as many folks coming in, maybe a little bit more predictable in timing. I know supporting these things is tremendous, and I think that you also drive to more consistency. So you're starting to get less of the conflicting messages, I think, that can come through otherwise. I don't want to use up all the time, but let me turn this over to Robin. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Just a question for you, and then I'll take any question from the audience. We spoke last night at dinner. I mean, J&J, Novartis, Amgen, these huge companies, and yet we have suppliers here that maybe have 10 million, 15 million, 50 million in revenue. Talk about how they can take actionable steps in their world and how it compares to your world, where those of us outside look at you guys and say, you have everything at your fingertips. So could you speak a little bit to that?
That's a great point. Ironically, we don't, right? I mean, we have a lot of resources, but we're dealing with some of the very same challenges. So I think my comment about changes in business, we're expanding and contracting business and moving in business and trying to stay ahead of that is very much the same thing that you're dealing with. Staying ahead of the regulations, understanding where it's going in our requirements for our patients in the markets that we're in. It trickles back through. So you might think of a large organization that may have everything at their fingertips, but the reality is we are in fact dealing with the exact same issues. And I can tell you that out of my own experience, having worked in small companies. I've worked in very small. I was number 33 at one point in the hiring profile, and our issue there sometimes was we didn't have enough momentum sometimes to be able to make a difference, and yet I see that in some specialty areas you can have the same thing in a large business. I know that I'm confident that you're probably also dealing with situations where you have people asking to come in and do audits, and they may be a very, very small part of your business, and yet you're accommodating them and you're doing all the right things to support that. There's a situation where we're all kind of dealing with the same challenge. You have small firms that have the same responsibilities, the same liabilities, the same requirements, the same needs to do that, and large ones that are in fact doing the very same thing. And understand that sometimes, and I'm sure you know this from where you're sitting, that even though it's a very large pharma, large, multinational company, some cases we get into very specialized areas as well, and may not always be a huge customer to individuals here, and so I think we're all experiencing some of the same things. I think the biggest piece that I see is the broadening of a global market, the global regulatory requirements, the expectations, and the different nuances that come along with that, and really trying to stay ahead of that curve.
Before my friend Robin speaks, I want to just kind of brag on Robin a little bit. Robin is a very senior person at Novartis, VP level person at Novartis. I'm grateful for the whole team for coming down. She was in Switzerland yesterday, and who knows where beyond, just like we all travel, but to take the time to come out. Our organization, RX360, is made up of volunteers like a VP Quality from Novartis and different folks like this. One of the things that you get access to with our organization is Robin will pick up the phone and listen to you, head of quality from XYZ small company in India, if you got a quality problem. And is that worth something to you? I don't know how much you pay Lackman and all these other guys to come in, but you got Lackman Plus on steroids right here. And so this is one of those benefits of being part of our affiliation, which is we don't really talk about that much, but it is huge. So with that, Robin, I'd like to hear the Novartis perspective.
Okay. Can you hear me? Great. Currently with Novartis, I'm global head of external supply for all divisions of Novartis. Like Bill, I have worked with smaller organizations, biotech firms as well, about 30 plus years in the industry, so I've seen a lot. What has changed? So we've talked about data integrity. Ben has mentioned that. Bill has mentioned that. It's always been something that we've been interested in. So really what has changed, right? What has changed is the enforcement and the regulations becoming very explicit. That is what's changed. So if you think about the new FDACA regulations, they're requiring you to really know your supply chain as a manufacturer. So our suppliers are really going to get inundated with questions and queries and us wanting to have that information because we need that information to comply with the new enforcement that's happening with our agencies around the world. So it's a big world and it's a very small world. So we have the FDACA regulations that are still being implemented. So what else happens? We go and we look at Europe. Those regulations are changing as well. You may or may not be aware of the Chapter 5 changes around APIs in the European GMPs last year, but they are now effective. And what they explicitly say is that manufacturers have to know their supply chain. They have to audit their APIs. So if we're getting APIs for you, we have to audit you. It's now in writing. They also mentioned that third-party auditing companies like RX360 can be used. So that's also a plus. They have to be qualified. They have to go through the rigor of being capable of performing the audits in lieu of the company, but they can be used. And why is that important to you as suppliers? It's important because if you're using a third-party auditor like RX360 or some of the others that are out there, you have an audit that is available to other companies that you're supplying. So rather than having 8 companies come in, rather than Novartis and Merck and J&J and Amgen coming in, they will accept an RX360 audit. So that will save you as suppliers. It's really important more now than ever, as I mentioned, because the regulations are coming very explicit. For excipient suppliers, the regulations also touch on that as well. It's more of a risk-based approach, but your customers will be reaching out to you for that information as well. So it's really more around enforcement. Not a whole lot has changed in terms of what we're looking at, but there's more enforcement and there's more explicitity in what we need to do as manufacturers. The other regulation that's coming out in the next few months is Annex 16 in EU. That's the QP release of APIs. They are required to know the full supply chain of the API. So the supplier and the supplier's suppliers, in order for them to release batches of material within Europe. What does that mean to you as suppliers? Again, it means you're going to be inundated with questions. You're going to be inundated with people wanting to come to your facilities to audit because, again, we have to comply with those new regulations. Bill mentioned knowing where your material is going, right? So who's using it and what are they using it in? This is going to become critically important to you as suppliers. Because if you're selling me an excipient, and you're selling Bill's company excipient, and you're selling Ben's company an excipient, are you really? And do you know that you are? Suppose company X buys excipient A from you, and they put it in their filing as an active ingredient. And this does happen. I've seen it a lot. You need to be aware that they have your material in a registration as an active ingredient because FDA or TGA or HMRA or whomever could show up at your door because that is an active ingredient in a registered product around the world. So extremely important that you know not only where your suppliers are getting their materials and tracing it backwards, it's also important to know where it's going. So you will not just be out of the picture, as to say, as someone who has supplied company X. There will be ramifications depending on how they're using your product in their product. So really important to understand that. What have we been seeing in trends? Again, a lot of data integrity. And I have something quite interesting because I think if you're talking about data integrity, you really have to look at the maturity of your quality and compliance organization, and you have to look at the quality and compliance culture of the companies that you're dealing with, even in your own suppliers. Because there's not a lot of clarity around what that means. Ben gave you some good information in terms of accuracy, contemporaneous, the whole ALCOA acronym. But do people really understand what that means? And the reason I say that is I was actually participating in an audit, shadowing, And I got this brand new shiny lab book, and it was awesome, and all of the information was just really well documented, and it was so neat and clear and pristine. And it looked like it had all been written yesterday. And in fact, it was all written yesterday. So that is a data integrity issue. But I don't say it lightly, because they gave me this information and I questioned. I said, you know, this looks as if it was written rather recently. And they said, yes, it was. We knew you were coming. We wanted to make it very neat for you. I said, well, do you have the data? So they came to me with books and books of the data that they compiled together, and they were proud of that. So what did that say to me? They were not trying to be devious. They were not trying to deceive. They didn't understand that that was not the right thing to do. So I think it's really important to make people understand what the regs are, how to comply, and check for understanding, right? Because there were several people involved, all the way up to the quality person in charge, who knew they had written that lab book all over, just because we were coming. So there's a lack of understanding as well, and education is needed. But again, what's changed? Really, the regulations becoming more and more explicit, and it's really important in terms of protecting the patients and supply chain security, right? So we should self-regulate, we should do these things. Well, we're not going to rely on them more. You've now been told you must do these things. And so that impact, again, is going to be the outreach to you and your ability to supply information about your suppliers, your processes, and what is happening in your facilities. Okay? So I will give it over to Mark.
So any questions at all? There are no current members of the FDA here. If you've got a question, don't be afraid to ask. Mark was with the FDA. We're really grateful he's joined RX360. Mark?
All right. Thank you, Scott, and thank you, fellow panelists. So Scott wanted me to just give you a couple words about my background and why I'm at RX360 at this particular point in my career. So I'll start off with a little bit of background. I spent the last 4.5 years at FDA in the Office of Compliance at CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and I had come over there at a time when, right after the heparin incident, FDA was in particular the Office of Compliance in CDER was very concerned about what was going on with globalization and how that impacted our ability to regulate drugs and other medical products in the United States. So I was very fortunate to be able to move over from industry. I was actually head of international regulatory affairs for pharma, you know, the brand Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America organization in Washington, before joining FDA. And they hadn't had a whole lot of experience with downstream issues because they're not concerned with downstream issues at that particular point in time, although ultimately, because of heparin, although it started very far upstream, the ability to recall batches of material that we get, and please understand, heparin is ubiquitous, right? It's its own therapy, but if you've got a vial or a parenteral bag or for an infusion bag that has blood in it, trust me, heparin's in that also, right? Because it's an anticoagulant. So it's everywhere. So getting this material back from the distribution channels that we were utilizing in the market environment were very, very difficult for us. And it caused, as a consequence, unfortunately, the 81 deaths that Scott spoke to. When it happened in the United States, everybody else took notice of it because they said if it could happen in the FDA, it can happen everywhere else. And in fact, it did happen other places, just not on the scale because the sourcing of materials was different in a lot of different other, for instance, in Europe. But that really launched a whole cascade of events that led me to be here right now. First off, it led me to want to leave pharma and go into the FDA because they needed some downstream expertise. They didn't know at that time even what a third-party logistic provider or 3PL was. was. There wasn't a single person in the Office of Compliance that I ran into that knew what a 3PL was, okay? So I was very happy to get involved during that reorganization. I was specifically in the Office of Drug Security, Integrity, and Response. We helped staff that up. We got it up and running. I worked in the policy area. One of the things, the key things that I did was work with, based upon my experience at pharma and working with international regulatory authorities, was to be able to start a program under an organization. It's not a treaty-based organization, but it is a cooperative scheme called the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, which, if you look at the Pacific Ocean and you go around the rim on both sides of the Pacific, you will see most of those countries, including the United States, Canada, Mexico, and North America, all participants across the board in APEC. And we meet every year, a few times a year, and every once in a while, well, actually not every once in a while, every single year you'll see where they have a heads of state meeting where President Obama go up there and they'll sign declarations. Well, those declarations come out of a lot of different activities in a lot of different industry sectors, one of which is the pharmaceutical sector. And one of the programs I started there and managed for the last 3.5 years was something called the Roadmap to Promote Medical Product Quality and Supply Chain Integrity. And this, again, all started as a consequence of what happened in heparin. We realized that if we're going to do our patients justice in the United States and globally, we needed to have a better understanding of what we could do as regulatory authorities looking ex-US or ex-China or ex-Europe or ex-wherever you are. We needed to be able to work in a venue that would allow us to be a hell of a lot more reactive or responsive to these kinds of threats to patient safety. So the approach that we took is we established 10 work streams with subject matter expertise coming from across industry and across regulatory authorities, and I mean globally. We looked at GMPs. We looked at everything upstream on GMPs. We looked at downstream through distribution practices, import and export operations, and everything else that we can that's ultimately going to yield a strategic plan for all the APEC members to utilize. That'll happen probably at the end of this particular year. But because of that activity and the exposure and the concerns that were raised in this world that we live in today, and I actually have a phrase for it, I call it deregulation by globalization. What it is it's a deliberate attempt on the part of regulatory authorities to understand how globalization is specifically impacting them. And understand, regulatory authorities, we exist for one particular purpose, right? And I still say we because they're still our partners. And they should be your partners. But we exist for one thing. You know, we all talk about quality, but our role is not quality. Our role is quality assurance. It's the assurance of those medicines getting to that patient, that the safety and efficacy data that we understand associated with that drug is actually going to treat that patient as intended. And it used to be, in order for us to measure that release testing out of a finished dosage form, GMP-compliant manufacturing facility was a pretty good proxy about what that quality of medicine was going to be when it reached the patient. Well, that is over. Every regulatory authority understands that now. With all the mergers and acquisitions and the fact that you have facilities around the globe that are manufacturing for multiple locations and multiple jurisdictions across the globe, has changed all that. And the regulatory authorities through APEC and other mechanisms, and I'll explain one more of those, have come together and said, we as organizations responsible for the health and welfare of our patients are failing at our job because we don't understand how globalization is affecting us, okay? And they have started multiple initiatives along these lines to better understand that. But when you talk about manufacturing facilities that are located wherever they may be, offshoring, cost savings, whatever the case may be, and they're manufacturing for multiple locations, multiple customers. How many of you people are throwing away batches of material because you missed specification for one customer or one location? How many of you are throwing it away? Or are you forum shopping? And you're saying, I missed specification, I'm going to go with the product group, and I'm going to move it somewhere else. Well, that's what's happening out there, right? What does that tell you about the robustness of your process? Well, these are the things that the regulatory authorities are very, very, very concerned about, right? So typically upstream suppliers, you haven't paid attention to GMP, but the reality is, when we talk about documentation and control, these guys and their API suppliers have to know what's going on up there, because guess what? Simple C of A testing coming in through the door is no longer acceptable for releasing material into finished dosage for manufacturing facilities. You and suppliers better know a heck of a lot more about who your suppliers are and what contaminants or adulterants may actually be in the materials that are coming into your facilities, because you're probably not testing for them if you're just doing C of A, confirming the C of A. So this is such a concern for the regulatory authorities across the globe, because we do not want another heparin incident. I don't think anybody does. I'm not throwing and casting blame. I think there's probably some chemist who thought that was actually the same as, right, when he had introduced oversulfated chondroitin. I think he thought literally it's the same as. Analytically, it looked the same, right? Therapeutically, it had completely different consequences. But in November, the global regulatory authorities, the heads of all their agencies across the globe, came together in Mexico City, and they established now for the first time ever the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities. The secretariat for that organization is Health Canada. And the number one issue for all of them in this ICMRA environment today is the quality of medicines and their components moving in international commerce. And how do we get a grip on that? So that is the backdrop in which I came to RX360, because as much as I appreciate and understand how the regulatory authorities are going to try and address this problem, being a little bit forward thinking and being a little bit maybe of an insider of how that is occurring, I still think, the regulatory environment in which is going to impact all of us is going to be coming with some full force pretty soon. It's already in effect in a lot of ways, as Robin pointed out. But we got to do a better job, period, not because of those regulatory requirements, but we got to do a better job because we're concerned about our patients. Right? That should be the motivation. If your motivation is just the dollar, then I don't think you even ought to be in this business personally. That's my personal opinion. I think if your focus is patients, then you should be in this business, and you should get all the resources and take advantage of all the benefits that you possibly can. This is one of the reasons why I came here, because I am very sympathetic to what it means to now have suppliers of suppliers being audited. And what does that mean to the manufacturer or somebody downstream from them from a cost standpoint? Well, now it's 3 times the audit cost, right? Well, RX360 has a program, and we don't have a monopoly on this. Other organizations, I'm sure, will start something similar to it. I hope they do. But the reality is, our partner over here, BSI, just on the medical device side, they do 15,000 audit days a year on the medical device side. There's not a single regulatory authority in the world that's ever going to be resourced to be able to spend that much time in doing inspections. We have to take that on as our, in the private sector. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, I decided it was very important to come to RX360. Because ultimately, I'm going to be advocating for accreditation programs for audit firms like they did in the medical device side. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. So we have time. We're time for just one or two questions. If you prefer to ask a question privately, the RX360 booth is there. We have this great panel here available for just about the afternoon. So please come by and avail yourself to them. Any questions as we close? And thank you for staying a little bit into your lunch hour. One other quick comment. Yesterday, we partnered with Habitat for Humanity New Orleans. Why? Why does RX360 have partner with Habitat? Habitat is an organization that builds things to serve a basic human need and volunteers together to do that which is a home. RX360 has partnered together with pharma and suppliers to help fill a basic need, which is safe medicine. So that's why we partnered. Ben, if you can hand me my bag down there. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. Yeah, the T-shirts. That's it. So our partner BSI made this happen, and I'm just going to take a second. So we're going to award our friends the nice T-shirts for coming out. We protect patient safety. So thank you guys for coming out and supporting us, and thank you so much for attending this panel. And I appreciate the panelists.